In the glittering heart of New York's Gilded Age, where chandeliers sparkled and every gaze could crown or condemn, a single dance set scandal aflame. Francesca Templeton, daughter of a fading name, dared to waltz with a man society called unworthy. Thomas Whitmore, a steel magnate scarred by tragedy and burdened with secrets. What began as whispers in the ballroom would soon become a storm, testing love, reputation, and the fragile balance between duty and desire. Before we begin, tell us from where you're listening today and share with us what you love most about period romances, the passion, the drama, or the forbidden choices. New York City, February of 1895. The chandeliers of the Waldorf's grand ballroom cast 1,000 glimmers upon the polished marble floor, as if the stars themselves had descended to witness the closing ball of the winter season. Laughter echoed beneath the gilded cornices. Strings of a Strauss waltz filled the air, and crystal flutes shimmered with golden champagne. Yet amid the glittering spectacle, Francesca Fanny Templeton stood utterly still, alone, though surrounded by hundreds. She wore seafoam silk taffeta, stitched by hand, with ivory lace hugging her shoulders in a style just daring enough to be noticed, but not to provoke scandal. Her auburn hair was swept into a low chignon, a few tendrils framing her pale, freckled cheeks. The Templeton emerald brooch, her mother's last heirloom of real worth, pinned her bodice with trembling defiance. At 26, she was no longer the fresh bloom of debutante spring, but neither had time withered her beauty. It had, instead, sharpened it into something far more dangerous, a beauty laced with silence and sadness. Across the ballroom, matrons whispered behind silk fans, "Poor dear, still unmarried. A shame." And with those eyes, but their eyes held triumph, not pity. Fanny knew the rules. Women of good breeding must never appear eager. And yet, there she was, unclaimed, untouched, unwanted, save for the fortune hunters who knew her family's coffers were hollow. Her mother, perched like a falcon near the musicians, tilted her head and gave a discreet nod toward Philip DeWitt. He was perfectly acceptable, handsome, heir to a railroad fortune, and thoroughly boring. He approached Fanny with the confident smirk of a man who knew her options were thinning. She could feel his gaze before he spoke, a gaze that weighed her like a number, not a woman. Fanny smiled without warmth and took a calculated step back. Then, before reason could reclaim her, she turned toward a man standing alone by the far column. He was tall, broad, entirely out of place. His evening coat, though well-tailored, bore none of the subtle flourishes that marked the old families. His bow tie was plain, his gloves worn. His face, partially shadowed by the candelabra, held a stillness that was almost unsettling, except for one thing, a pale scar traced along his right cheek, cutting a quiet line through otherwise stern features. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He wasn't trying to be seen. Fanny stepped toward him, one breath, then another. "Would you care to dance?" she asked. The man blinked, as if unsure he had heard her correctly. His voice, when it came, was deep and smooth, like steel cooling in water. "If you wish, miss." They stepped onto the floor. Conversation ceased. The orchestra hesitated for a heartbeat, then resumed. Fanny could feel the eyes burning into her back, her mother's shock blooming like a silent scream. The man held her gloved hand gently, as if unused to such softness. His movements were careful, too careful, and she realized with a strange flutter that he was nervous. "You don't belong to this room," she said quietly. "No," he replied, "but neither do you." The words struck her like a bell inside her chest. They danced, imperfectly, awkwardly, but there was something true in every step, something unspeakable pressing against the space between them. When the music faded, he released her hand with a reverence that unsettled her far more than any improper touch. Before she could ask his name, he offered a faint bow. "Thank you, Miss Templeton." "Dumb," and then he vanished into the crowd. It wasn't until a curious murmur reached her ears that she turned to the direction of two gentlemen arguing near the punch table. I tell you, that was Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore, the steel man, the one with the scar. I thought he never attended society functions. Exactly, which makes her dance with him all the more curious. Fanny's breath caught. Thomas Whitmore. The name echoed like the aftershock of thunder, a magnate, a mystery, and now her last waltz of winter. By the time the gas lamps flickered out along Fifth Avenue, the gossip had already taken root. At breakfast, the drawing room of the Templeton townhouse, once the scene of glittering brunches and discreet musical recitals, was heavy with silence. The crisp February sunlight filtered through damask curtains, gilding the silverware with a deceptive warmth. Yet no fire burned in the hearth, and the tea had already gone cold in its pot. Fanny sat stiffly at the end of the long mahogany table, her gloved hands resting atop her lap. The New York world lay open before her, the ink still fresh. On the society page, in a column nestled between engagement announcements and travel notes, a short but explosive line stood out in elegant cursive. One belle of old society caused quite a stir last evening by waltzing with an unfamiliar gentleman of industrial bearing. The mystery man bore a noticeable scar, and a name best left unspoken in polite company. Her mother, seated across from her, lowered her teacup with a tremble barely concealed beneath years of practiced poise. "Francesca," she said, her voice low but vibrating with suppressed fury, "do you comprehend what you've done?" Fanny met her gaze calmly, though her heart thundered beneath the bodice of her morning gown. She wore dove-grey wool trimmed with fine lace, modest and proper in every way, yet it offered her no shield against the storm mounting across the linen tablecloth. "I danced," Fanny said, "with a man who asked nothing of me but a moment of grace. He is not a man, he is a scandal made flesh." Mrs. Templeton's cheeks flushed crimson. "A labourer with a fortune, yes, but not a gentleman, not one of us." Fanny folded the newspaper with careful fingers. "His name is Thomas Whitmore." At that, her mother gasped, as if the name itself were a profanity. She stood abruptly, the folds of her morning blue morning dress rustling with agitation. "He is steel, Francesca. Steel and coal and soot, and the blood of men who die in his factories while he counts his millions. You were seen dancing with him, smiling at him. What do you think the Van Alstynes will say?" "What they always say," Fanny replied. "Only now, it will be about me." That evening's waltz had already become the week's most whispered headline. She had committed no sin, made no vow, only accepted a dance. Yet the ballroom, with all its polished civility, had witnessed her trespass. And society, ever thirsty for a breach of decorum, had begun its quiet, merciless circling. By mid-morning, 3 of Fanny's acquaintances had already sent polite refusals to her mother's invitations for Tuesday's tea. One claimed a sudden cold. Another was unavoidably detained. The third did not even offer a reason. The message was clear. The Templetons had allowed something unseemly to brush their threshold. Mrs. Templeton responded with ruthless efficiency. She penned a letter to Philip DeWitt, inviting him to call. DeWitt, golden-haired, heir to a railroad empire, with a name older than the country itself. His interest in Fanny had been noted for some time, but now it would be sharpened, weaponized, offered as a cure to an infection yet unnamed. Fanny remained silent as the plans were made around her. Her gaze drifted toward the window, to the snow-dusted avenue beyond. Carriages passed in stately procession, their wheels muffled by the hush of February slush. How many of those within had read the same lines she had in the world? How many had seen her, really seen her, that night beneath the chandeliers? But it was not shame that gripped her. It was something else, something like defiance. She retired early that evening, but sleep did not find her. Instead, she lit the lamp beside her writing desk and retrieved a small notebook from the drawer. There she began her inquiry, not into gossip, but into the man behind the name, Thomas Whitmore. His factories stretched from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. He had begun as a foundry worker in Pittsburgh, risen to foreman by 22, and by 35 had built his own empire of steel and rail and shipworks. He was credited with constructing bridges that now spanned rivers no one thought crossable. But his name was also etched in controversy. The riots of '87, when workers had taken to the streets after a wage cut, the bitter strike at the Carrow Mills, the fire that had consumed a portion of his New Jersey plant and taken 3 lives. There were darker whispers, too, of cold pragmatism, of settlements paid in silence, of men who spoke against him and lost not only their livelihoods, but their standing in the industrial circles that fed their families. And yet, interspersed with these accounts were odd flashes of contradiction. A reporter had once seen him delivering blankets to tenement housing on Christmas Eve. A reformer wrote that Whitmore had funded the installation of safety equipment in his mills years before it became regulation. There was mention of a tragedy involving his younger brother, but the details were thin, guarded. Fanny set down her pen and stared into the amber glow of the lamp. Who was this man? Ruthless tyrant or reluctant titan? How could both versions exist within the same skin? 2 days passed without word. Then, on a grey Thursday morning, a discreet knock sounded at the Templeton door. The butler returned with a single calling card resting on a velvet tray. Fanny reached for it, her fingers tingling as they brushed the edge. Mr. Thomas Whitmore, to Miss Templeton, with a request for her time. Location: St. Mary's Settlement House, Avenue C and 10th Street, Saturday, 11 o'clock. No flowers, no flattery, no embossed monogram, just a request. When her mother asked if she had received any correspondence that morning, Fanny simply replied that she would be going for a walk on Saturday, alone. She arrived at the settlement house beneath a leaden sky, her cloak buttoned high and her bonnet veiled against the biting wind. Avenue C was a world apart from Fifth Avenue. The air smelled of coal smoke and cabbage stew. Children darted through puddles with bare feet. The buildings leaned like tired shoulders pressed together. St. Mary's was modest but clean, a large brick building with whitewashed window frames and a heavy wooden door. Fanny hesitated at the threshold. Then she stepped inside. What she found within defied everything she had been taught to expect from the world of industry. A wide room held 24 children bent over readers, their fingers tracing syllables aloud. In another corner, immigrant women listened as a nurse taught them how to wash linens with boiled water and soap. A young man showed a boy how to mend a shoe. The warmth of coal stoves mingled with the scent of bread. And then she saw him. Thomas Whitmore, in shirt sleeves rolled past the elbow. He stood beside a bucket, mopping up a spill near the hearth, his back to her. No entourage. No coat of wealth or arrogance, just a man wiping muddy water from a floor so others might walk in safety. He turned. Their eyes met. And in that moment, silent, bare, and entirely unobserved by society, Francesca Templeton saw something in Thomas Whitmore that neither ballroom nor newspaper had revealed. Not power, not scandal, but truth, and it terrified her. The wind off the East River carried the scent of iron and ash, mingled with the sharp tang of coal smoke and the sourness of overcrowded streets. It was Saturday morning, and the sun, pale and indecisive, cast a wan light over the Lower East Side, as if reluctant to touch the bricks blackened by years of soot and sorrow. Fanny Templeton stepped down from the carriage alone, her boots finding uncertain purchase on the wet cobblestones of Avenue C. Around her, the city breathed differently. There were no uniformed doormen, no flower carts brimming with violets, or white-gloved nannies pushing prams. Here, the sidewalks overflowed with shouting vendors, with linen strung between windows like weary flags, with boys running wild in clothes too thin for February, and women hunched beneath the weight of battered market baskets. St. Mary's Settlement House stood like a sentinel in the midst of it all, a square red brick building with a faded wooden sign and steps worn soft from years of use. The door bore no brass handle, only a simple iron latch polished smooth by many hands. Fanny hesitated, glancing back once at the carriage now disappearing into the grey haze. She was alone, utterly so, in a part of the city where her name meant nothing, and her presence sparked curiosity instead of recognition. She lifted her gloved hand and knocked. A thin girl with dark curls opened the door, her sleeves rolled up and her cheeks flushed. She blinked up at Fanny with wary eyes before stepping aside. "He's in the main hall," she murmured in accented English, and vanished into the dim corridor beyond. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of soap and boiled potatoes. A coal stove radiated warmth in the center of the hall, its surface black and gleaming. Children sat on rough wooden benches, their fingers tracing the words in battered readers, lips moving silently. In one corner, a group of women hunched over fabric, sewing seams under the watchful gaze of an Irish nun. In another, a young man taught a boy how to hammer the sole of a shoe. And behind all this, unassuming, without ceremony, stood Thomas Whitmore. He wore no frock coat, no gloves, no silk cravat. Instead, his sleeves were rolled past the elbows, his collar unbuttoned, his hands stained faintly with ink and oil. He stood beside a wide table, adjusting the alignment of a printing press with the focus of a craftsman, his brow furrowed in concentration. Yet when he looked up and saw her standing there, something shifted, an intake of breath, a moment of stillness that reverberated deeper than any greeting. "Miss Templeton," he said, his voice low and steady. "You came." "Oh, I said I would," she replied, removing her gloves one finger at a time. She had chosen her attire with quiet deliberation. A dove-grey walking dress with modest embroidery at the cuffs, a matching cloak trimmed with dark velvet, and a bonnet that framed her face without drawing attention. No pearls, no silks, no unnecessary flourishes. She had not come to impress. She had come to understand. Thomas set down the wrench and gestured to a bench near the stove. "Would you like to sit?" Fanny did not sit. Instead, she stepped further into the room, her gaze sweeping over the scene around them. A boy sneezed loudly. A baby wailed in the nursery upstairs. A woman spoke in Polish, gesturing to her pregnant belly as she asked the nurse something urgent. There was nothing elegant here, no music, no chandeliers, no measured speech. But there was life, honest, hard, and relentless. "How long have you supported this place?" she asked quietly. He crossed his arms, wiping one palm against the other absently. 8 years, since I built the second foundry in Newark. The workers needed more than wages. They needed places like this. Education, food, medicine. A place where their children could read instead of cleaning chimneys." She looked up at him, really looked, at the scar on his cheek, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes never rested long on one thing but kept scanning the room as if measuring its needs. He did not walk like a gentleman. He walked like a man used to being in motion, a man who carried weight invisible to the eye. "And why invite me here?" she asked, her voice softer now. He hesitated. Then he met her gaze, unflinching. "Because if you're going to judge me, I'd rather you see what I build with your own eyes, not through gossip, not through a ballroom lens." Fanny drew in a breath. "I did not come to judge." "No," he said, and a flicker of something unreadable passed over his face. "Then why are your hands trembling?" She looked down. They were trembling, just slightly, enough to betray that this visit, this place, mattered more than she had dared admit even to herself. Before she could respond, a small boy with hair like straw and a patch sewn over one eye darted toward them, tugging on Thomas's coat. "Mr. Whitmore! Mr. Whitmore! The stove's gone cold again!" Thomas crouched immediately. "Show me." The boy took his hand and pulled him across the room. Fanny watched as Thomas knelt beside the stove, checked the firebox, and gently coaxed the flames back to life. The boy watched him with adoration. A moment later, Thomas returned to her side, dusting ash from his hands. "They trust you," Fanny said. "I earn it," he answered. She nodded slowly. "Every day." Their eyes locked, and in that suspended moment, something passed between them. Not affection, not yet, but something rawer. Recognition, the meeting of two souls, shaped by different worlds, but tempered by similar hungers, for meaning, for honesty, for something unpolished and real. Fanny's throat tightened. "This is good work, Mr. Whitmore. Thank you for letting me see it. You're the first person from your world who's wanted to." She bit her lip. "I think I stopped belonging to that world the night I danced with you." That, at last, drew a reaction. His gaze dropped for an instant, as if her words had struck somewhere deep. Outside, church bells began to chime noon. Fanny gathered her gloves once more. "I should go." Thomas walked her to the door. As he opened it for her, he did not bow nor reach for her hand. Instead, he asked, "Will you return?" She turned to him, the cold wind catching her veil and lifting it briefly between them. "I don't know," she said, "but I will not forget." She descended the steps, her boots clicking softly on the stone, and disappeared into the grey churn of the city. That evening, back in the parlour of the Templeton house, her mother waited with narrowed eyes and a handkerchief pressed to her temple. "You went," she said. "I did." Mrs. Templeton rose. "That dance was an indiscretion, but continued involvement. Francesca, that becomes a stain." Fanny met her mother's fury with quiet steel. "And what is your remedy then? Marry me off to DeWitt and pretend I never felt anything beyond silk and silver?" "Exactly that," her mother snapped. "You are a Templeton. You do not belong in places that smell of soot and desperation." But Fanny no longer heard her. Not fully. She had seen something today, not just a man, but a world her society refused to acknowledge. And in that world, she had found a version of herself unmoored from drawing rooms and debutante lists. A version that, though uninvited, was no longer willing to remain silent among the forgotten. Winter in New York wore its finest mask that February. Snow drifted softly over the city like powdered sugar over a fading cake, hiding soot-stained buildings beneath a mantle of fleeting purity. The icicles along the cornices of Fifth Avenue townhouses shimmered like chandeliers in the morning sun. But beneath the stillness, something restless stirred. A whisper, a question, a name spoken too often in parlors and carriages alike. Francesca Templeton had become a subject of speculation. It was not her gowns, still modest, still elegant. It was not her behavior, still composed, still dignified. It was his name, Thomas Whitmore. He did not court her in the way society expected. There were no bouquets of hothouse roses, no diamond pendants delivered in satin boxes, no invitations to the Metropolitan accompanied by a chaperone and 6 witnesses. Instead, his courtship arrived in quiet, deliberate fragments, slipped into the fabric of her days like threads that caught the light only when one looked closely. One morning, a parcel wrapped in brown paper arrived by messenger. Inside was a slim volume of essays, The Labourer's Dignity by Jane Addams, with a note written in a firm, unembellished hand. "You spoke of wanting to understand. These pages helped me once. Perhaps they will help you too. T.W." Another day, an invitation arrived, not for supper or dancing, but for a public lecture at the Cooper Union, on tenement reform and industrial accountability. It was not an affair for debutantes or heiresses. It was a gathering of reformers, journalists, working-class leaders, and one steel magnate seated quietly in the last row. Fanny went alone. She sat 2 rows ahead of him, never looking back. Yet when the crowd dispersed, he stood by the door, waiting. He did not offer compliments. He simply asked, "What did you think?" And then listened, truly listened, as she spoke. They walked together sometimes. Once, after a snowfall, they crossed Central Park beneath a sky the colour of pewter. The lake was half frozen, the carriages fewer, the world quieter. He offered his arm and she took it, not because society demanded it, but because something in his presence silenced the part of her that was always measuring, always calculating. That day she wore a woolen cloak with a fox fur collar, and he, in his heavy overcoat and plain felt hat, looked less like a magnate and more like a man who had walked through fire to stand beside her in the snow. They did not speak of their feelings. Not yet. But when a sudden gust blew her bonnet loose, and he stepped forward to catch it, their hands brushed, and the stillness that followed was louder than any declaration. At the opera, they were seen. It was a performance of La Traviata, and Fanny sat in the Templeton box with her mother, her aunt Lydia, and to her dismay, Philip DeWitt. Across the theatre, in a less prominent box, Thomas watched the stage with quiet attention. He did not glance her way once. And yet she felt his presence like heat through glass. During intermission, as champagne glasses clinked and velvet skirts swept marble floors, Philip leaned close. "Your admirer watches you like a workman admiring cathedral windows," he murmured, his voice lined with mockery. Fanny turned to him with a smile as crisp as ice. "Perhaps he sees value where others only see spectacle." Philip chuckled. "You enjoy being contrary, don't you? But there are lines, Francesca. Your flirtation may prove amusing now, but society doesn't forget these things." She did not answer, but her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from fury. That fury reached its full measure at Mrs. Van Alstyne's musicale. The room was a portrait in opulence, gold brocade draped over settees, and footmen moved silently among guests with trays of cordial. A string quartet played Chopin, and everywhere eyes sparkled with the kind of delight that fed on discomfort. Fanny entered on her aunt's arm, wearing a gown of sapphire velvet and jet beading, dark and dignified. Conversations hushed briefly as she passed. Mrs. Van Alstyne, whose pearls were nearly as tight as her opinions, greeted her with air kisses and thinly veiled contempt. "My dear Francesca," she said sweetly, "I do hope you're enjoying this season of illumination. You've certainly cast light on parts of our city most young ladies never dare to tread." A few ladies laughed behind fans. Fanny's spine straightened. "I find the shadows more instructive than the chandeliers," she replied softly. It was then that she saw Philip DeWitt standing near the mantel, watching her with a slow, sardonic smile. After the performance, a forgettable soprano struggling through Die Forelle, Fanny slipped away from the press of voices and into the adjacent conservatory. The orchids glistened with dew, and the warmth of the hothouse air made her cheeks flush. She needed silence. But silence was not to be hers. She turned and found herself face to face with Miss Celeste Huntington, once a friend, now a reluctant acquaintance whose gaze brimmed with something brittle. "Francesca." Celeste hesitated, then reached for her hand. "Forgive me, but I must speak plainly." Fanny froze. "Your name is on everyone's tongue," Celeste whispered. "They say you are seen walking alone with him, that he sends you books, that you sat beside laborers at Cooper Union." "All of that is true," Fanny replied. "Then you must be careful. You are treading very close to the edge. You may not care what they say, but your mother does. Your name, your future. Philip DeWitt still defends you, but others, they are beginning to turn." "And what of you?" Fanny asked gently. "Have you turned too?" Celeste's eyes filled, then quickly cleared. "I still remember the girl who taught me how to tie a ribbon properly before my debut. But I also know the rules we live by. And I know how easily the door closes when you break them." Fanny looked down at her gloved hands. They did not tremble tonight. They burned. When she returned to the drawing room, her mother stood waiting. One glance at her daughter's face, and she knew something had shifted. "That woman insulted you," she hissed, her voice a thin thread of outrage. "And that man still haunts your name." "I was not insulted," Fanny replied. "I was reminded of who I am." That night, alone in her room, Fanny opened the book Thomas had given her once more. Between its pages, she found a folded note she hadn't noticed before. "You asked why I don't send roses, because roses wither, but ideas take root. And if they're shared, they bloom again. T.W." She pressed her fingers to the page. her breath shallow. Outside, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the city in white. But inside her, something warmer stirred. A storm not of cold or fear, but of clarity. She was no longer dancing for the approval of society. She was walking, deliberately, dangerously, toward something real. The snow had begun to melt along the avenues, leaving behind damp cobblestones and streets heavy with the scent of thawed coal and distant ash. Winter's elegance had faded into a dull greyness, and with it, the glittering distraction of the season gave way to the whispering rot beneath. It was on one such grey afternoon that Fanny Templeton found herself standing at the entrance of the Whitmore shipping yards along the Hudson. The air there was thick with smoke and brine. Towering cranes stood like metal giants against the sky, and workers moved in rhythmic unison, their sleeves rolled, their voices hoarse. She was not dressed for such a place. A navy wool cloak lined in sable, boots polished, gloves still scented faintly of violets. Yet she did not flinch as she walked through the iron gates that separated her world from his. Thomas was waiting for her in the office above the yard, a long, narrow room with high windows overlooking the chaos of the docks. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, but his gaze softening the moment she entered. "You came," he said, though there was no question in his voice. "You asked," she replied, pulling back the veil of her hat and meeting his eyes. "I always do." The silence that followed was not heavy, but reverent, like the quiet between the end of a hymn and the start of a prayer. He gestured toward a chair, not the ornate one behind the desk, but a wooden one by the stove. She sat. He did not. Instead, he moved toward a cabinet, drew out a small decanter of brandy, poured 2 glasses, and handed her one without a word. "I imagine," he began, his voice rougher than usual, "that your mother would faint if she knew you were here." "She already has," Fanny answered wryly. "Twice, this week." He smiled at that, a true smile, not the guarded, habitual kind he wore at galas or lectures. But then he turned back to the window. "You've heard the rumors, of course," he said, "about the harbor contract." "I've read them," she corrected, "and I don't believe them." He did not thank her. He did not need to. "I'm used to being called ruthless," he said after a moment. "Efficient. Cold. That doesn't trouble me. But this—" he paused. "This accusation, this lie, is not aimed at my fortune. It's aimed at my name. And for a man like Thomas Whitmore, name meant more than gold." Fanny sipped the brandy. It burned, but not unpleasantly. "Who would want to do that?" she asked, though a part of her already suspected. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I've made enemies. I've cut through contracts others fought years to win. I refuse to grease hands or host dinners for aldermen. I don't charm. I build." He turned toward her now, his face shadowed by the grey light. "There's something you should know, Francesca, about the scar and my brother." Her breath caught. "You don't have to—" "I do." He crossed the room slowly, as if the telling itself weighed more than steel. Then he sat, not on the chair opposite hers, but on the edge of the desk, closer, as if needing proximity to ground himself. "His name was Ezra," he began, eyes fixed not on her, but on some memory that lived in a place she could not reach. "He was 4 years younger, finer than me, smarter, gentler. He wanted to teach, not build. But when I opened the foundry, he came to help. Said he believed in what I was doing." A pause. There was a crack in the furnace line, a hairline. I knew it. I'd seen the pressure rising for days. The inspectors didn't flag it. I told myself it could wait. His hands flexed slowly, the knuckles white. It didn't. Fanny remained still. She felt the pull to touch him, to reach for his hand. But this was a grief that had never been shared. It had been locked behind rivets and iron. And now it was melting before her, word by word. It happened at dusk. There were sparks. Then a roar, like the world breaking. He was closest to the breach. His voice broke, but he did not stop. I pulled him out. I carried him through the fire, but the damage was done. The skin on his arms, his lungs. He didn't last the night. Fanny's eyes filled. I'm so sorry. Thomas looked at her now, fully. The scar along his cheek seemed deeper in the dim light. This, he said, lifting his hand to the mark on his face, was the price I paid, but not the only one. I see him in every furnace, every heat gauge. I've rebuilt the entire system. I shut down the line for 6 months, installed safety valves no one else wanted to invest in. He exhaled. I don't tell anyone this, because sympathy doesn't change risk, and men don't follow a leader who bleeds. Fanny stood then, slowly, the brandy glass forgotten on the floor beside her. She crossed the room and stood before him. You didn't bleed that night, she said softly. You've been bleeding ever since. Their eyes locked, not as strangers, not as flirtation, not as rebellion, but as something unspoken, forged in the quiet agony of guilt and the rare grace of understanding. Her fingers hovered near his, and in that silence he reached for her first, not in passion, but in gratitude. Thank you for telling me, she whispered. Now let me tell you something. He looked at her, waiting. I hate the world I live in, she said, her voice low and tremulous. Not the clothes, not the music, but the rules, the constant measuring of worth by last names and inherited paintings and whose great-grandfather signed what. I'm tired of being told that a woman's only currency is her compliance. Her hands were shaking now. I want to be useful. I want to matter. I don't want to be a wife kept in velvet and used for dinner conversation. He studied her face. You could matter, he said. Anywhere. She smiled faintly. Perhaps, but I don't want to matter alone. Before he could answer, a knock rattled the office door. A foreman entered, breathless, holding a folded newspaper. Sir, this just came from the press. You'll want to see it. Thomas took the paper, unfolded it, and read. His face changed. Fanny leaned in. The headline, bold and cruel, read, Whitmore accused of harbour bribery, empire built on broken law. Below it, a column penned with venom. Accusations, anonymous sources. Mentions of secret meetings, of untraceable funds, of whispers in City Hall. No evidence, only speculation. Dangerous, seductive speculation. It's begun, Thomas said. Fanny touched his arm. We'll face it. But even as she spoke the words, she felt the storm gathering. And somewhere in a parlour uptown, Philip DeWitt sat in silence, too quiet to be innocent. The city had turned colder, not in temperature, but in manner. The chill no longer came from the wind off the Hudson, but from behind closed doors, from the brittle smiles of society matrons, from the quiet refusals written in graceful calligraphy. Francesca Templeton had become an uncomfortable subject, and by extension, so had her mother. The scandal in the Hearst Journal had landed like a thunderclap upon their already fragile household. Though no names were directly printed, everyone knew who the article accused. Thomas Whitmore's face, hard-lined and scarred, had been crudely sketched above the headline, the ink heavy and unforgiving. Her mother had collapsed upon seeing it, claiming a sudden fever. In truth, she could no longer bear to look her daughter in the eye. Fanny had read the article once, then again, then a third time. She'd searched it for facts, for evidence, for substance, but there was nothing. No proof, only shadows pretending to be truth. Anonymous informants, hushed whispers about meetings behind closed doors. It was all strategic filth, carefully crafted for those hungry for scandal and blind to substance. Yet it worked. By the end of the week, invitations stopped arriving. The florist no longer delivered as regularly. Aunt Lydia cancelled an afternoon tea without excuse. Even Celeste Huntington, ever the kind friend in appearances, had written a note of regret, claiming that the flu had gripped their house and would likely linger indefinitely. Fanny stood at the tall windows of her sitting room, watching the carriages pass below, the clatter of hooves muffled by the damp. The city went on, but she felt as if the earth had shifted beneath her feet. She had sent 2 notes to Thomas. He had replied to only one. Let them speak, he had written. I have lived with worse. The truth will out in time, but if you stand with me now, your name will fall long before mine rises again. She had stared at the words for an hour, memorizing them until her hands trembled. That morning she made her decision. She would not wait for time. She would search for truth. Down the corridor, beyond the hush of her mother's room, and the careful movements of silent maids, another door creaked open, her father's study. Once, it had been the command center of a man whose voice once guided financial empires. Now it sat in the dust of disgrace, with its leather chairs faded and its fireplace cold. Her father sat hunched at his desk, spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, his hair more silver than she remembered. He looked up as she entered, blinking in the lamplight. "Francesca," he said softly, "is your mother unwell again?" "She's always unwell now," she replied, approaching. "But I didn't come about her. I came about you." He raised an eyebrow, curious. "I need your mind," she said gently. "The one that built the Templeton name, the one that once read contracts the way priests read scripture." He removed his spectacles and studied her carefully. "What do you want, child?" "To find the lie," she said, eyes gleaming with urgency, "to uncover the root of it. This scandal against Thomas, it's not chance. It's crafted, designed to ruin him, and I suspect I know who benefits most." He was silent a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood. His voice was quieter now, but not weak. "Sit," he said, "and bring the papers." They worked for hours, their heads bent over every article, every public document regarding the harbor contract, every published interview and city minutes. Her father moved slowly, but with clarity. He spotted inconsistencies in phrasing, strange timelines, sudden approvals. Then, at dusk, Fanny laid the letter on the desk, the one the journal had printed as proof. Her father read it aloud once, then twice in silence. He rose, crossed the room, and opened a drawer. From within he pulled an old correspondence, a letter signed years ago by DeWitt's cousin, Mr. Charles Ashford. He laid it beside the newspaper clipping. The signature was identical, too identical. Her father turned toward her. "This," he said, "was traced." Her breath caught. "You're certain?" "As certain as I am that your mother will have my head for this," he replied. "And yet, I believe the time for silence has passed." They penned a letter to the district attorney, then another to a journalist known for chasing truth rather than gossip. Finally, Fanny folded the evidence, the forged letter, the matching signature, the discrepancies, and placed it in a lacquered envelope. She stared at it, the weight of it heavy in her gloved hands. "I must deliver this," she whispered. Her father nodded. "Then go." But Thomas would not receive her with gratitude. He met her in the quiet of the settlement house, where the lamps cast golden shadows against worn brick, and the hum of the city seemed a world away. He stood by the window, arms crossed, his face unreadable. She offered him the envelope. He did not take it. "I know what it is," he said. "Then you know it's enough to clear your name." Thomas's jaw tensed. He looked not at the letter, but at her. "And yours?" he asked. "Will this letter clear yours?" "I don't care." "You should." "I won't." Still, he did not move. "I won't fight this in their arena," he said. "I won't beg for a place at their table. If I answer this now, I give them power." "If you don't," she replied, her voice trembling, "they take everything." He walked toward her slowly, his steps deliberate. "And you?" he asked, standing just close enough to feel her breath. "What do they take from you?" "Everything I was supposed to be," she whispered, "and everything I no longer wish to become." The space between them pulsed. Then she turned, not to leave, but to act. The next morning, Francesca Templeton walked alone into the office of the district attorney. She laid out the forged documents. She answered every question with precision. She spoke not as a daughter of wealth or the companion of a powerful man, but as a woman who had chosen to believe in something dangerous. The news spread before sundown. The Templetons' name was now tied to scandal, not as victims, but as agitators. And Fanny? She became a question few dared to answer. Celeste no longer returned her notes. The Van Alstynes removed her from their guest lists, and Philip DeWitt remained suspiciously silent. But in her room, beneath the folded letter from the district attorney and the ink-stained newspapers, lay a simple card, unsigned, written in a familiar hand. "You stood when no one else did. That will be remembered. T.W." She pressed the card to her chest, not for recognition, but for courage. The cold that morning was not of winter, but of something deeper, a silence that settled into the seams of Francesca Templeton's gloves, into the wool of her cloak, into the hollow space between her shoulder and her mother's absence. The handsome carriage pulled to a stop at the corner of Center Street and Franklin, just outside the white limestone facade of City Hall. The sun shone with indifference, lighting the grand columns and the frost-fringed pavement where newspapermen loitered with ink-stained fingers and keen eyes, ready to pounce on the scent of power or disgrace. Fanny stepped out first, her boots striking the ground with quiet authority. Her walking suit was a deep forest green, lined in black satin, her hat adorned with a single feather, no ribbons, no soft pastels, no attempt at softness. She did not come for sympathy, she came for truth. At her side, walking slower than he once did, but with shoulders squared by purpose, was her father, once a man whispered about in banks and boardrooms, now just a name half remembered on old ledgers. Yet that morning, with a folded dossier tucked beneath his arm and pride rekindled in his blood, Henry Templeton looked like the man he had once been, and the man his daughter had never stopped believing in. They climbed the steps in silence. Inside, the district attorney's outer chamber was warm with gaslight and the clatter of secretaries. Murmured names passed from desk to desk. Heads turned as she entered, not with recognition, but with the sharp curiosity reserved for women who refused to play by the rules. She gave her name. They were expected. When the doors opened, the prosecutor rose to greet them. He was young for such a title, with a nervous energy poorly concealed by his polished demeanor. But his handshake was steady, and his eyes never left Fanny's. "You have evidence?" he asked. She nodded. Her father laid the folder on the desk with a measured calm. Inside, page after page of cross-referenced signatures, ink analysis, and timelines too precise to ignore. The prosecutor studied it in silence, then again, and then a third time. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Ashford directly," he said at last, his tone shifting from cautious to resolute. "You'll need more than that," Fanny replied. "You'll need to make it public. You'll need to give Mr. Whitmore what was stolen from him." The prosecutor looked at her, truly looked, and nodded. "We'll begin today." And so, the machine began to turn. By the following morning, the silence that had suffocated the Templeton home had turned into whispers, low, crackling, urgent. Something was happening at City Hall. Rumors stirred in the parlor rooms, in the clubs, even at the dressmakers. Francesca Templeton, it was said, had walked into the lion's mouth with her father and returned unburned, but the lion still had teeth. Her mother, upon hearing of the visit, packed her trunks and left for her sister's estate in Connecticut, declaring herself unable to endure the city's cruelty. In truth, she could no longer bear the sound of her daughter's name in other women's mouths. Fanny remained in New York, alone. The days that followed were slow, agonizing. She walked through streets where once she had been admired, now glanced at with subtle aversion. In the florist's shop, the assistant turned away, feigning distraction. In the bookshop, she overheard two women whisper, not cruelly, but with something worse, pity. Yet even in isolation, she walked with purpose. She returned to St. Mary's twice that week. There, no one looked away. The immigrant women took her hands and thanked her for the extra coal delivery. The children called her Miss Fanny with cheerful irreverence. And in the hall where Thomas had once shown her the stove, a new plaque had been nailed to the wall. Whitmore Literacy Room, in honor of Ezra Whitmore. She stood before it a long time. She did not cry. On the fifth morning after their visit to City Hall, the butler entered her sitting room with a trembling hand and a folded edition of The New York World. He placed it on the tea table, said nothing, and left. Fanny unfolded it slowly. Front page, Ashford confesses to letter forgery. Whitmore cleared. Below, a column dense with revelations. Under the pressure of formal questioning and the threat of perjury, Charles Ashford had admitted to authoring the forged letter. He had used a signature template from old correspondence, created a false timeline of meetings, and planted the letter through a discreet contact at the Hearst Journal, hoping to undermine Whitmore's bid for the new shipping line. The instigation, though not proven in court, was strongly implied to have originated from a rival family with economic interest in the harbour contract. Philip DeWitt's name was never mentioned directly. It didn't need to be. Fanny read the article twice, then a third time. She folded it neatly, placed it in the fire, and watched the flames consume the lie that had nearly broken them all. But the city did not forgive quickly. The invitations did not flood back. The matrons who had once called her charming now called her dangerous. Her name remained a matter of discomfort. But something had shifted. On the 7th night, she attended a concert at Steinway Hall, alone. She wore black velvet, no jewelry. She entered with her head high and took her seat at the center of the hall. The whispers began at once, but so did something else. Celeste Huntington approached her during intermission, offering a hesitant smile and a gloved hand. "You look radiant," she said, "even when you terrify the entire mezzanine." Fanny smiled faintly. "They'll recover, perhaps, or they'll start copying you." Behind them, Mrs. Van Alstyne stood rigidly, lips pursed, eyes locked on Fanny's profile. She did not speak. She simply watched. And for the first time, there was no mockery in her gaze, only caution. Fanny sat through the second half of the concert in silence. As the orchestra played, her hand drifted to her lap, where a small envelope lay tucked between the folds of her program. She had found it earlier that evening, slipped under the door of her home. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "I told you the truth would out, but I never expected you would deliver it with such grace. I am proud to know you. T.W." She closed her eyes. For once, the music could not compete with the sound of his voice echoing in her mind. The reckoning had come. But it was not justice alone that marked this victory. It was the quiet emergence of a woman who had once been shaped by society's expectations and now walked entirely outside them, lit not by scandal or beauty, but by the flame of her own conviction. The city glittered that night like a thing reborn. Gas lamps bathed the wide boulevards in amber light, and the carriages that lined Broadway shimmered with frost like jewels in motion. Outside the Metropolitan Opera House, where marble columns soared into the starlit sky, a sea of velvet, silk, and expectation waited to be seen, to be admired, to be whispered about. But inside, behind the crystal chandeliers and the velvet-curtained boxes, something far rarer than spectacle was about to unfold. Francesca Templeton stood at her mirror, still as a statue, while her maid fastened the final hook at the back of her gown. She wore no diamonds. No borrowed tiara glittered in her hair. Instead, her dark auburn waves had been swept into a low chignon, and her ears bore only modest drops of sapphire and onyx. Her gown was like nothing she had worn before, a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, heavy yet fluid, with an embroidered bodice of fine steel thread that caught the candlelight and glinted like a forge's last ember. The neckline curved gently across her collarbone, revealing the dignity of her bearing more than any ornament ever could. The dress had not been chosen to impress. It had been chosen to stand beside him. A knock came, and then he entered. Thomas Whitmore, in black evening tails, a silver-grey waistcoat, and no insignia. He wore no society pin, no ancestral crest. Only a pair of steel cufflinks engraved with 2 letters, E.W. He paused as he saw her. They said nothing for a moment. Then his voice, low and warm, filled the hush between them. "You wear steel like a crown." Fanny turned to face him fully. "And you," she murmured, "wear humility like a king." He offered his arm. They descended the staircase together, and when they stepped into the ballroom of the Metropolitan Opera House, hand in hand, the room stilled. It was not silence, not entirely. Gasps rippled through the gilded balconies. Fans fluttered like nervous wings. Champagne glasses trembled. But none of it mattered, because they walked in not as a scandal, nor a rebuke, nor even a curiosity. They walked in as truth, side by side, not a step behind, not a length ahead. Together. The charity ball had always been a spectacle of excess, a season's final jewel, where fortunes were paraded under the guise of benevolence. But that night, the true spectacle was quiet. The steel magnate and the woman who had nearly been destroyed for believing in him. They danced once, just once, a slow, reverent waltz beneath the chandelier, her hand in his eyes never leaving hers. It was not graceful in the polished, calculated way expected of society, but it was honest. Afterward, they did not return to the floor. They made their way through the crowd, slowly, stopping when addressed, greeting politely, never lingering. Mrs. Van Alstyne approached them, pearls gleaming, a faint smile carved into her lips like a weapon disguised in lace. "Miss Templeton," she said sweetly. "And Mr. Whitmore, how unexpected!" Fanny inclined her head. "We were invited." "As all are," Van Alstyne replied, "but few are remembered." Thomas's voice was calm. "Then we will make the remembering worth something." The older woman's smile faltered, only slightly, but enough. Then she turned and walked away. Thomas looked down at Fanny. "That felt almost enjoyable," Fanny smiled. "It felt earned." Later, while the orchestra played its third quadrille and the opera boxes brimmed with glittering guests, Thomas led her away from the ballroom, through a side corridor lined with painted panels, into a quieter chamber just beyond the main hall. It was empty, except for the soft light of a wall sconce and the muted echo of music behind thick velvet curtains. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he walked to a low table and retrieved something wrapped in dark cloth. He returned to her, unwrapped it, and revealed a small brass compass, worn at the edges but polished clean. "It was Ezra's," he said. "He carried it even when we didn't travel. Said it reminded him that north was always somewhere, even when you felt lost." Fanny took the object gently, cradling it in her palm. The needle trembled, then settled. "I didn't come here tonight to be seen," Thomas continued, voice tight with emotion. "I came because I needed to ask you something. Not in the eyes of society, but here, where no one watches." He reached into his coat and drew out a ring, not large, not flashy. A band of white gold with a single oval-cut sapphire, deep and dark, surrounded by two tiny diamonds. "Francesca Templeton," he said, "you've stood in fire without flinching. You've walked beside me into rooms that were never meant to hold people like us. And you've done it not for glory, but for something quieter, something stronger." She could not speak. He continued, his voice a whisper now. "I don't offer you ease. I don't offer you acceptance, not by their standards, but I offer you partnership, purpose, and a love that has grown not from games or flattery, but from truth." His hand trembled as he held out the ring. "Will you marry me?" Fanny looked at him, the man whose name had once been a rumor, whose hands bore the weight of iron, whose heart had been hidden behind fire and forged guilt. She reached for the compass, closed her fingers around it, and then placed it gently in his hand. "I will be your north," she said softly, "if you will be mine." He slipped the ring onto her finger, the cold metal warming instantly against her skin. No orchestra played for them. No applause followed. Only the quiet breath of a promise made in the space where scandal had been burned to ash, and from it something sacred had begun to bloom. The spring air in New York carried the scent of lilacs and coal, mingling in a contradiction that somehow suited the bride perfectly. Francesca Templeton became Francesca Whitmore on a rainy morning in late May, beneath the faded stained-glass windows of St. Barnabas Chapel, tucked between a pawn shop and a narrow alley where children played marbles. It was not a grand cathedral, and there were no imported orchids or diamonds sewn into her hem. But the lace she wore had belonged to her grandmother, and the pearl combs had been gifted by Thomas in a small velvet box he had carried in his coat for weeks, unsure if she would still want him after everything. The guest list defied every rule of society. Among the pews sat women from St. Mary's settlement house, Polish mothers in stiff wool shawls, Irish widows with worn gloves, one Italian seamstress with a tear in her veil who whispered to herself in prayer. Near the back stood Mr. Abrams, the bookbinder, and several girls who had learned their letters under Fanny's guidance. At the front sat Henry Templeton, dignified in his best coat, his hand trembling only slightly as he reached for a handkerchief when the vows began. And beside him, to the surprise of everyone, including herself, was Louisa Van Alstyne, spine rigid, but eyes oddly soft. She had come without her daughter. There were no violins. A single cello and a weathered upright piano played Mendelssohn as Fanny walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her dress was simple. Ivory satin, long sleeves, a high neck trimmed with hand-stitched lace. She wore no tiara. No jewels but a garnet brooch at her throat, and the look in her eyes was not that of a debutante one, but of a woman choosing with clarity, with courage. When Thomas turned to face her, there was a flicker of something vulnerable in his usually impenetrable gaze. His scar, visible now without the distraction of society's glare, seemed less like a mark of shame and more like a badge earned. He whispered something as she reached him, 3 words barely audible above the cello. She nodded once, and then they spoke the ancient words, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the kind of quiet conviction that echoes through the bones long after the memory fades. There was no reception, only coffee and pastries in the church's modest hall. Fanny stood with Thomas at her side as dozens of guests came forward, not to flatter or gossip, but to thank her for her lessons, her letters of reference, the firewood she had paid for without fanfare. A girl named Anya presented her with a paper bouquet made from discarded newsprint, and Thomas watched as Fanny bent to accept it with both hands, as if it were gold. They did not sail to Europe. There were no carriages waiting with white horses, no hotel suites in Paris or gondolas in Venice. Instead, 3 days later, they unlocked the doors of the Templeton Whitmore Technical School on the Lower East Side. The school had once been a warehouse, forgotten and water-stained, with beams that creaked when pigeons landed. Now it held promise. Long tables where boys learned measurements and girls learned machines. A small library built from donations and cast-offs, smelling of glue and tobacco and ink. Fanny taught reading every Wednesday afternoon in a room with chalk-stained windows and no curtains. She read Jane Eyre aloud in sections, pausing to explain words like resolve and integrity, watching as the children sat straighter with each chapter. Thomas had insisted the mill boys learn ventilation systems first. Air comes before arithmetic, he had said, and he meant it. He'd seen lungs blackened before the age of 20. He visited each classroom weekly, listening more than speaking, sometimes bringing a stray engineer or mechanic to give a demonstration. He refused to accept honorary plaques or public praise. The steel speaks for itself, he often said, but the steel did not speak kindly at all times. In the early weeks of their marriage, they faced trials not uncommon for newlyweds, but theirs came in the shape of business betrayal and social snubs. A cousin of DeWitt attempted to sabotage the new shipping contract by proposing an alternate route, one that cut across land owned by Thomas's mills, forcing a potential buyout or delay. The press hinted that the Whitmore name had been tainted by too much charity, too much mingling with the immigrant classes. The Hearst Journal ran a column titled, "Gown Hemmed in Ashes, Is Mrs. Whitmore Society or Savior?" The phrase spread like smoke. They were denied entry to 2 balls that season. Fanny received back her own engraved calling card, torn in half. At a dinner hosted by the Langleys, she overheard the phrase "factory wife" whispered by a woman she had once lent gloves to. But they endured. Thomas remained steady, never raising his voice, never mocking the petty cruelty of those who had once courted his investments. He held her hand each evening as they read by lamplight. She preferred Emerson. He leaned toward Darwin. They disagreed over wallpaper, over paint colors, over the hiring of a particular secretary whom Fanny found too flirtatious. But in each disagreement, there was tenderness, respect, a willingness to bend. On their third-month anniversary, he surprised her by commissioning a mural in the school's foyer, a steel tree with golden leaves, each one bearing the initials of a student who graduated. Fanny touched the first leaf with reverence. "They'll think it's too grand," she whispered. "Then let them aim higher," Thomas replied. And when the spring rolled into summer, they faced down another storm. At the annual Steel Consortium meeting, Thomas was challenged on his mill reforms by a board member who accused him of prioritizing philanthropy over profit. Fanny, who had attended as an observer, rose from her seat and quoted mill output figures from memory, laying out the correlation between worker health and efficiency with the precision of an economist. There was a long silence after she spoke. One man applauded. Only one. But Thomas reached for her hand under the table and held it the entire ride home. That night, she whispered against his chest, "We don't just live together, Thomas. We build together." He said nothing, only pressed a kiss to her temple and held her long after the lamp was extinguished. Their marriage was not one of fanfare or fairy tales. It was something forged, tested, tempered, a union not of convenience or calculation, but of choice, of fire and steel. And through each trial, each sideways glance and boardroom threat, they became not just partners, but pillars. Whispers still followed them. But now, those whispers spoke of admiration, of curiosity, of a pair too strange to be dismissed, too sincere to be scorned, and in the privacy of their home, a modest townhouse with creaky steps and a garden, Fanny tended herself. There was laughter. There was ink-stained fingers and iron blueprints and strawberry jam on linen napkins. There were days filled with labor, and nights filled with music from the old Victrola Thomas, restored as a wedding gift. And on one particular Wednesday, Fanny found on her desk a note in Thomas's hand. It read, "Today is the day the boys study pressure systems. They asked if you'd read the next chapter. I told them only if they finished the equations. And they did. Every one." She smiled and went to teach. The sun shimmered on the East River like a sheet of hammered gold, and New York, always impatient, paused for once. The city had come to witness the christening of something more than steel and rivets. It had come to name a bridge. It stood like a colossus between boroughs, arching over the water in clean lines and uncompromising strength. A structure whispered about in architectural circles, marveled over by engineers, and criticized by financiers for its cost. But it was done. And on this crisp autumn morning, the Whitmore Bridge was ready for its unveiling. Crowds gathered early, factory workers still in their soot-stained overalls, mothers with children in shawls, newsboys hawking papers with headlines that finally printed praise instead of innuendo. Somewhere near the front, a girl named Anya held a flag and tugged at her brother's sleeve every time she spotted someone from the Templeton Whitmore School. Fanny stood beside Thomas, her gloved hand resting lightly in the crook of his arm. She wore deep burgundy velvet, her hat trimmed with a single black feather, and a watch pinned at her collar. It had been her father's once. She wore it today in silent tribute. Thomas, ever austere in public, allowed himself a quiet smile when the mayor stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat with pomp. The speech was long, filled with phrases like visionary leadership and progress made manifest. But Thomas's gaze never left Fanny, not when the band played, not when the ribbon shimmered like fire beneath the morning light. And so, the mayor concluded, gesturing with one gloved hand toward the structure. "This bridge, linking not only boroughs but lives, shall bear the name of the man who dared to see the city not as it was, but as it could be. I give you the Whitmore Bridge." There was applause. But not all of it came from the white gloves and polished canes in the front row. No, most came from the calloused hands in the back, the women with babies in their arms, the boys who had once been bootblacks and now carried toolboxes and books. That sound, raw, grateful, true, rose like a hymn above the East River. Fanny's throat tightened. She turned slightly and looked up at Thomas, but he was not watching the crowd. He was watching her. After the ceremony, they walked the length of the bridge alone, long after the dignitaries had been whisked away in carriages and the banners taken down. The wind tugged at her skirts, and she let her hand trail along the smooth railing. Below them, the city breathed and clanked and whistled. "I once thought I'd name it after my brother," Thomas said softly. "It was his dream too." "You still could," Fanny replied. He shook his head. No, he would have hated the attention. He would have loved the steel. They stopped at the midpoint where the view opened wide. Smoke stacks in the distance, the harbour glittering. Beyond that, nothing but sky. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed, softened by time. He handed it to her without a word. Fanny opened it. It was her old dance card. The ink had faded, but the words remained legible. Waltz, Mr. T. Whitmore. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. "I never told you," he said, voice low, "but that night I almost didn't ask." "Why?" "Because I saw how they looked at me, and how they looked at you. You had roses in your hair, and I had coal on my boots." She smiled through her tears. "You had iron in your spine." He brushed a strand of wind-blown hair from her cheek. "You chose me before they ever approved of me, before I had a name worth printing." Fanny held the card to her heart. "You had a name. It just hadn't been heard by the right ears." He leaned close, forehead against hers. "And you've given mine a meaning I never knew it lacked." Back in their townhouse on Gramercy Park, the parlour was still warm from the fire. The maid had left a tray of tea and a stack of letters. Social invitations, testimonials, a request from a girls' school in Brooklyn asking if Mrs. Whitmore would speak on the value of independent learning. Fanny removed her gloves slowly. She placed the dance card in its box, along with the paper bouquet from Anya, a photograph of her father at the school's first graduation, and the copy of Jane Eyre marked with a child's penciled notes. She sat by the window, watching as dusk painted the rooftops in amber and slate. Thomas entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her and sat across the room, as he often did when he needed to think, but wanted her near. For several moments, they said nothing. Then Fanny, eyes still on the city, spoke. "Do you ever wonder if we hadn't danced?" He did not hesitate. "No, because I would have found you anyway, at a school, in a bookshop, at a protest, somewhere. I would have found you." She looked at him then, and for all the moments they had already shared, for the bridges built, the whispers silenced, the titles earned, this was the moment that lingered most. Not the applause, not the marriage, but the certainty. He had found her, and she had chosen him. Not for his money, not for redemption, but for the way he let her speak, fight, dream, and burn, equally, together. And in a world still ruled by lineage and lace, that was no small rebellion. It was legacy. The house on Gramercy Park had changed over the years, yet sunlight still found the same corners where Francesca used to dream by the window, before her name was ever whispered in headlines or etched into the marble of philanthropic halls. Outside, autumn clung to the trees like golden lace, soft and fleeting. Inside, the scent of ink, old books, and honeyed tea lingered. It was a day like so many others, quiet in its beauty. But Francesca felt it, how time had folded itself around her life, how memory lived not in milestones, but in small, radiant moments. She stood in the library, sorting through correspondence. One letter bore the crest of a girls' college in Boston, requesting her presence as a guest lecturer. Another came from the technical school she had helped build. Her Wednesday reading class had doubled in size. At 36, Francesca Templeton Whitmore had become to some a symbol, to others a scandal-turned success story. But to those who truly knew her, she was a woman who had chosen to rewrite the rules rather than live by them. The papers had long since stopped calling her the steel magnate's bride. Now they called her Director, Patroness, Mrs. Whitmore, or simply Francesca Templeton, depending on the angle of the article. Her favorite title, however, remained the one whispered to her in the still hours of the morning: Mama. Eleanor was 5 now, a willful child with curls like spun copper and a ferocious love for stories where girls wore trousers and tamed dragons. James, almost 10, spent his afternoons at his father's mills, asking questions about pressure gauges and steam valves, then returning home to help his mother shelve books in the school's modest lending library. Thomas remained her harbour, steady, thoughtful, sometimes gruff with fatigue, but always generous with his silences, the kind that said, "I see you. I still choose you." They no longer needed grand declarations. They had built something stronger, a life shaped by shared purpose, forged through battles fought side by side. Their marriage was not a fairy tale, but a revolution in velvet gloves. Francesca often received invitations to teas and musicales once denied her. Some she accepted, others she declined. She preferred the evenings spent hosting scholarship students for dinner or teaching immigrant girls how to sign their names with ink-stained fingers and trembling pride. Not all had forgiven her audacity. Some never would, but enough had learned to respect it. Even her mother, once rigid with society's expectations, now visited often, bringing warm lemon cakes and gently correcting Eleanor's French. At the last visit she had said, "You've done well, Francesca, not because you married wealth, but because you refused to be purchased." Francesca had turned away to hide her tears, not of sadness, but of something older, deeper, recognition, vindication. And sometimes, on nights when the world felt too loud or too shallow, she would climb to the attic where old things were kept. Dance cards, dried roses, a handkerchief embroidered with a name she almost married. In the bottom of a carved walnut box, she kept the one relic that mattered most, a faded square of ivory parchment, Waltz, Mr. T. Whitmore. That single line had unraveled her fate. She did not choose Thomas for his fortune, nor for the murmurs of scandal he carried like a second skin. She chose him for the fire he bore within, and because he had not tried to extinguish hers. And now, a decade later, the world was slowly catching up to the truth Francesca had always known, that a woman's value was not measured by dowries or debutante gowns, but by the depth of her convictions, the sharpness of her mind, and the courage to dance with the wrong man in front of all the right people. That afternoon, Eleanor tiptoed into the attic with a worn copy of Jane Eyre tucked under her arm. "Mama," she whispered, "read me the one where the girl runs away but comes back stronger." Francesca smiled. "All right," she said, lifting her onto her lap. "But tonight, we start with a story of a girl in a pink dress, who was never meant to stand out, but ended up changing everything." And as her voice filled the room, soft and certain, the autumn sun poured in like applause, warming the dust, the pages, and the heart of a woman who had never stopped choosing herself. Some stories don't end with fireworks, but with the steady glow of a love that chose truth over appearances, purpose over privilege, and dignity over silence. Francesca and Thomas taught us that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin quietly, in a single dance, in a whispered promise, in the courage to defy what society expects. Their journey wasn't easy. It was built on loss, risk, and sacrifice, but also on respect, integrity, and love that only grew stronger with time. If you were moved by their story, if you believe that real love is forged in fire and not in fairy tales, we invite you to share this video with someone who still believes in second chances and quiet strength. Maybe it's your mother, your sister, or a dear friend who's always dreamed of a romance written in stardust and steel. And if you made it all the way to the end, type the word waltz in the comments below. That way, we'll know you walked every step of this journey with us, from the first scandalous dance to the final sunrise over Gramercy Park. Don't forget to check the story suggestions in the cards. We've prepared more historical love stories filled with strong heroines, unforgettable twists, and the kind of emotions that linger long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for being part of this moment. Your presence here keeps these stories alive. Until the next one, may you always choose the kind of love that lets you shine just as brightly.